Chapter 3. Theories of Schooling. Why not whip the teacher when the student misbehaves? Diogenes of Sinope. Schooling is seen as a good thing. Those who are uneducated are seen as lacking something essential to being fully functional, fully human. From Plato to Comenius to Kant, humanity is something that is imposed upon the young. Even Paulo Freire, a favorite of leftists, believes in a humanizing pedagogy, presumably one that makes people more fully human. We need to spend less money on the military, more money on schools, say the progressives. Their complete identification, we, with the nation-state, is utterly pathetic. Humanitarianism has saturated the left and the right. Everyone is working hard, oppressing themselves, all for a better humanity, a better future. Like George Bush, the progressives don't want to leave a single child behind. In Hebrew, there is one word for both education and chastisement. The powerful men of the ancient world were rather clear about what schooling entailed. Today it is of the utmost importance to conceal the role of schooling in society. Submission to authority is always the goal of schooling. The power wielded by authorities, the power to reward and punish, to habituate the individual to desired patterns of thought and action, works to integrate the individual into a hierarchical social order. 19th century prison reformers and progressive school reformers were working to make this integrating function more efficient and more total in its effects. Both groups were humanitarians because they sought to make the individual better adapted, obviously doing her a great service, to a new set of social conditions. Society had to be shaped into a different form, reformed. Society is the main actor and individuals merely respond. To those who haven't picked up on this clever phrasing, society can be understood as those who have the power to make administrative and legislative decisions. Individuals only act as a part of society to the extent that they submit to existent social conditions, and possibly try to influence those who hold positions of power. As John Dewey put it, through education, society can formulate its own purposes, can organize its own means and resources, and thus shape itself with definiteness and economy in the direction in which it wishes to move. At first glance, Dewey seems to be saying that education can determine the direction in which society goes, but in fact he says that society shapes itself through education. So education is really not determining anything. In other words, schooling is a technique that society uses. One cannot fault him for such truthfulness. Durkheim agreed that education is only the image and reflection of society. It imitates and reproduces the latter in abbreviated forms. It does not create it. Educators respond to changes in society and make sure their schooling produces the necessary products. In a Harvard lecture of the 1920s, George S. Counts said the following: "This is not the place to evaluate industrial civilization. Education must come to terms with industrial civilization and discover its tasks in the new age." Educators work within institutional confines, within the confines of their social roles as authorities and slaves, just like the Greek pedagogues, of the powers that be. Since most educators believe unquestioningly that schools serve a positive function in society, all of their theories of schooling and ideas for reform are likely to reinforce the basic assumption that schools are a good thing. Modern theories of schooling are based on a social ideal of progress. This is basically a conservative ideal in the sense that technological change tends to be irreversible and reform tends to build upon itself, by and large keeping institutional structures and social relations intact. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Schools have been steadily expanding, progress, and have been able to reform by accretion. The technical basis of modern industry may be revolutionary in the Marxist sense of bringing us closer to revolution within a linear model of historical progress. But is this revolutionary at all? Marx himself praised the essentially dangerous character of revolutionists such as steam, electricity, and the self-acting mule. Attributing such a character to technology is clearly an oversight, more or less incompatible with any revolutionary theory based on the need for an insurrectional rupture with our technological society. Marx's oversight stems from his failure to adequately identify the relationship between the productive apparatus and the capitalist system that produces it, and to fully recognize capital's domesticating function. The writings of Jacques Camat and Freddie Perlman are excellent in expanding upon these themes. In many ways, resistance to the proliferation of the factory system parallels the resistance to compulsory schooling. When a definite loss of autonomy was seen as a new and threatening imposition, radical acts of resistance and sabotage were not uncommon. The industrial system, along with puritanical morality, served to domesticate the exploited, allowing for resistance to be more easily recuperated through institutional channels such as union bargaining and political reformism. What were considered factory virtues are virtually the same thing as school virtues. Discontents who have internalized these virtues aim at tinkering with the repressive apparatus, not destroying it. Modern theories of schooling can be said to begin with Rousseau. Rousseau considered civilization some form of mistake, but he did not oppose it. In his view, society was the source of all evil. He did not, however, see the teacher as part of this evil, and consequently gave teachers invaluable advice about how to exercise their supposedly righteous control over their pupils. Begin, then, by studying your pupils more thoroughly, for it is very certain that you do not know them, he wrote. Rousseau gave the following advice in regard to the way teachers should control their students. Let him, the student, believe that he is always in control, though it is always you, the teacher, who really controls. There is no subjection so perfect as that which keeps the appearance of freedom. This statement describes much of the philosophy of modern schooling. The institutionalized authority of the teacher is a given. The question is how the teacher can make best use of this authority. Rousseau gave an excellent answer. To think that this somehow encourages the freedom and independence of the student is reasonable, as long as that freedom and independence is exercised within the boundaries set by the authorities. As B.F. Skinner said approvingly, Rousseau did not fear the power of positive reinforcement. B.F. Skinner was an influential behaviorist psychologist of the mid-20th century. His overriding interest was in the control and modification of human behavior, a practice he believed could solve the world's problems, if only everyone could value efficiency over freedom. B.F. Skinner's Beyond Freedom and Dignity is a work of profound scientific insight, but total crap compared to Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. Skinner feels that what people call autonomy is an illusion since no behavior is uncaused. He assumes that autonomy refers to the existence of causes of behavior and not the nature of those causes. The nature of the causes of human behavior is contingent upon social relations, which Skinner doesn't want to get into. The application of his science is allowed free rein only when reified social roles separate the controllers from the controlled, the managers from the managed. And since the application of Skinner's science of human behavior is his top priority, institutionalized authority and its relationship to scientific advancement must remain unquestioned. Skinner sees any questioning of the desirability of scientific advancement as taking a stubborn position of not knowing and valuing ignorance for its own sake. So anyone who abandons scientific thinking is doing so for its own sake, whereas the enlightened specialist obviously has a multiplicity of valid reasons for their practice. Skinner's agenda is made somewhat clearer in Reflections on Behaviorism in Society, where he bemoans the damaging influence of non-contingent reinforcers, or things that come to us for free. Such things do not allow the control of people by people to realize its full potentiality. So a gift economy is bad, and a capitalist economy is good because money is possibly the greatest of all conditioned reinforcers. As our social environment becomes increasingly complex, more control must be exercised over the individual growing up. Program sequences of contingencies in the hands of skillful teachers and counselors can lead to the complex repertoires demanded by a social environment, writes Skinner. The implications of Skinner's ideas for the modern classroom are profound. They explain much of the behavior of teachers and provide a scientific foundation for their future progress. He saw more efficient teaching practices as extremely important, hoping that teaching could eventually become a science. Indeed, much educational theory in the last 50 years has shared Skinner's behaviorist conception of teaching, an advancement from the older method of mirroring the factory. It is not the rules or the enforcement of rules that is most important. It is the habitual following of those rules that helps the individual internalize desired patterns of behavior. The focus shifts from more obvious forms of discipline to the use of techniques which encourage a self-discipline, which diminishes the need for those more obvious forms of discipline. Even early in the 19th century, Fichte saw this as ideal. The pupil of pure morality, a concept similar to what Jesuits might call being a man for others, Fichte professed, goes forth at the proper time as a fixed and unchangeable machine produced by his art, teaching, which indeed could not go otherwise than as it has been regulated by the art, and needs no help at all, but continues of itself according to its own law. This is the essential feature of modern schooling. Fichte called the ideal pedagogy an art. Skinner would call it a science, but the message remains the same. Even when the teaching of values is the professed goal of pedagogy, if modern techniques and methods of organization are employed, the approach, which Skinner might term mentalistic or not thoroughly focused on scientific analysis, has similar goals and effects upon the student as a purely behaviorist approach. During the 1950s, Benjamin Bloom and a team of specialists worked very hard to put together a book, in 2 volumes, called Taxonomy of Educational Objectives, the Classification of Educational Goals, which had a significant influence on government schools in America. It was designed as a tool to help educators classify the ways in which students are to respond to their lessons. Thanks to standardized testing, intelligence is the new idol that educational theory must bow to. The ideal student is a well-behaved and objectively intelligent automaton. The second volume deals with affective objectives, in other words, character development, attitude, values. Things that Bloom feels are not graded mainly due to the inadequacy of the appraisal techniques and the ease with which a student may exploit his ability to detect the responses which will be rewarded and the responses which will be penalized. In contrast, Bloom writes, it is assumed that a student who responds in the desirable way on a cognitive measure does indeed possess the competence which is being sampled. Due to this danger, educators must stress not just the outward conformity of socialization, but internalization, or the student's acquisition of values, organized into a moral code, used to regulate one's life. The book goes on to classify in a hierarchy the various responses to teaching that a teacher must bring about in the student. The peak of this internalization process is the student's characterization by a value or value complex. An example of this would be a student who has learned not to talk back. Such a student stays quiet and only speaks when the teacher allows. A less refined list of goals, functions of schooling was presented in the early 20th century by Alexander Inglis. In his book Principles of Secondary Education, he lists the 6 important functions of secondary education. 1. The adjustive or adaptive function. 2. The integrating function. 3. The differentiating function. 4. The propedeutic function, training the future guardians of the system. 5. The selective function. 6. The diagnostic and directive function, not necessarily in that order. So basically, students must be adjusted so that they behave, integrated into the social group, tested, sorted, classified, trained, etc. It would be difficult to better describe the function of schooling. Inglis sees the school for what it is, a social institution or agency maintained by society for the purpose of assisting in the maintenance of its own stability, and then the direction of its own progress. In this sense, it is clear that it is society and the network of control that covers it that must be destroyed. It is hardly radical to substitute the existing society for another one which will serve the same functions in different ways. In many ways, Marx's theory of alienation explains the student's situation as well as the worker's. Does not the knowledge that the student works to accumulate confront him as something alien, as a power independent of the producer? And to use Marx's words for the student, one could say that the student only feels herself outside her schoolwork, and in her schoolwork feels outside herself. Life itself becomes a means to life, or as the situation is felt, life has been reduced to mere survival. School is undoubtedly an institution that initiates students into a life of alienated living. In school, the student learns that learning requires its usually authoritarian counterpart, teaching. Once the young learn dependence, the other lessons come much easier. Is not knowledge treated as a commodity, and as such fetishized by the consumer's producers? It begins to acquire all the metaphysical power that modern man attaches to facts. All knowledge becomes interchangeable and divorced from social context, and units of knowledge are to be accumulated, having practical application only within the specialized world of academia. The detached objectivity of the scholar is idealized. As Raoul Vaneigem wrote, knowledge is inseparable from the use that is made of it. And academic knowledge, in this sense, knowledge that is not used against the interests of power, can only serve to enlarge and consolidate power. What makes power hold good, said Foucault, what makes it accepted, is simply the fact that it doesn't only weigh on us as a force that says no, but that it traverses and produces things. It induces pleasure, forms knowledge, produces discourse. It needs to be considered as a productive network which runs through the whole social body, much more than as a negative instance whose function is repression. In the era of fragmentary power, when all can share in its ability to compensate for the poverty of our everyday lives, the world of schooling reinforces power by managing and allocating knowledge, possibly power's greatest tool. When Marx mentions schools, he merely said that government and church should rather be equally excluded from any influence on the school. The pristine school, divorced from its social context, the school can look like a rather positive thing, but as long as there are governments and churches, they are going to have something to do with schooling. Schooling has a long history of pseudo-opposition from libertarians. Tolstoy, Ferrer, and Frere did not critique schools as such, but called for different educational practices. In Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Frere even talks of the pedagogy of the revolutionary leadership, tipping his hat to authoritarians such as Che Guevara and Fidel Castro. Revolutionary educational practices, if they are not based on a fixed ideology to which the masses are to be converted, cannot have anything to do with schooling or schools. Schools are institutions, and all institutions have a certain degree of permanence that can extend beyond the control of their initiators. They are not associations developed for a specific limited purpose, and they are not self-organized. Institutions perpetuate themselves because people organize each other's living activity through them, not living for themselves. In order for educational practices to have a subversive character, they must not aim to fit themselves into the dominant society as an alternative to what is already offered. They must be a part of a community actively seeking to undermine the dominant social order. The Ateneos, or storefront cultural centers of Spain in pre-Civil War times, which had classes for those who wanted to learn to read and write, provide a simple example. The Spanish anarchists did not try to build an alternate society, but rather a counter-society. Some conception of the difference between the two is essential. In order to destroy capitalism and the state apparatus, we cannot simply build new institutions and expect the old ones to fall apart. Only through attacking the old institutions and organizing ourselves in a decentralized manner can we function outside the realm of capitalism and attack it as a social system. Capitalist social relations must be actively subverted. We cannot simply form cooperative or collective exchange relationships which reproduce capitalist logic. The Soviet Union, for example, was never communist in any real sense. It could best be described as state capitalist. Max Stirner, a poor German schoolteacher, was one of the most radical thinkers of the 19th century. In The False Principle of Our Education, Stirner criticized popular theories of schooling of his time. Only a formal and material training is being aimed at, and only scholars come out of the menageries of the humanists, and only useful citizens out of those of the realists, both of whom are indeed nothing but subservient people. Stirner saw the ideas and knowledge acquired in schooling as being detached from the person who supposedly learned such things. Stirner criticized all abstractions which are held above people's own wills and desires. In an authoritarian society, such abstractions or ideologies seem to govern our actions to the extent that people merely accept the idea that they should serve such things, such wheels in the head. Clearly, schooling, which subordinates the individual to the social group, utilizes such abstractions in the socialization process. In criticizing the institutionalization of the socialization process that was taking place in his time, Stirner criticized authority, the crux of the matter. around which all socialization revolves. A more in-depth critique of schooling in particular came from Ivan Illich in Deschooling Society, published in 1970. Illich was opposed to the school as an institution and formed a cogent critique of its functions. Schools divide social reality. Education becomes unworldly and the world becomes non-educational. Illich saw childhood as a product of industrial society and a social category that perpetuates the authority of the school teacher. Once young people have allowed their imaginations to be formed by curricular instruction, they are conditioned to institutional planning of every sort. Instruction smothers the horizon of their imaginations. They cannot be betrayed, but only shortchanged, because they have been taught to substitute expectations for hope. His criticisms of schooling are manifestly evident and entirely valid. The school system today performs the threefold function common to powerful churches throughout history. It is simultaneously the repository of society's myth, the institutionalization of the myth's contradictions, and the locus of the ritual which reproduces and veils the disparities between myth and reality. The themes inherent in theories of schooling have been rehashed for centuries. It is all too easy to see the devastating effects of schooling in our everyday lives. People have lost their imaginations, and others must determine the meaning of our lives. Students are taught to recognize that they are constantly under surveillance. The rooms are distributed along a corridor at regular intervals. The teacher stands in front of the class, making sure that everyone displays acquiescence in receiving the lesson. Later, the students are examined, tested, observed, and controlled. The examination manifests the subjection of those who are perceived as objects and the objectification of those who are subjected. The superimposition of the power relations and knowledge relations assumes in the examination all its visible brilliance. We must be made dependent, even helpless, memorizing bits of knowledge without any need. All sorts of industries would collapse, John Taylor Gatto observed, unless a guaranteed supply of helpless people continued to pour out of our schools each year. Capital must dominate the future not just through the production of a new commodity, things and technologies, but through the production of a commodity people. Every individual is merely a component, a piece of machinery. This is the essence of modern schooling. To argue otherwise would be mundane, untrue, and utterly academic. Chapter 4. Notes on the Poverty of Student Life. I suspect God of being a leftist intellectual. Graffiti, Paris, 1968. The university is the training grounds for the future ruling class and their most dependable lackeys. Most university students, after being constantly adjusted throughout their youth, are already well adjusted to subservient roles. They are model consumers, if not always model students. The students who are content with their social role as students have accepted passivity. Some accept passivity by ignoring all politics, others by becoming politically active. The result is the same, a useful citizen, useful to others. Modern capitalism and its spectacle allot everyone a specific role in a general passivity. The student is no exception to the rule. He has a provisional part to play, a rehearsal for his final role as an element in market society, as conservative as the rest. Meanwhile, he basks in a schizophrenic consciousness, withdrawing into his initiation group to hide from that future. Students are vaguely conscious of why universities exist and what is expected of them. Most simply don't care. To be apathetic is to be fashionable. When Nietzsche said that the idealism of humanity was on the verge of deteriorating into nihilism and meaninglessness, he couldn't have been more prophetic. Instead of the transvaluation of all values that Nietzsche called for, however, we have experienced a further devaluation. Nietzsche saw nihilism as the devaluation of the highest values, a condition at once regrettable and full of possibility. Money, too, is fashionable. How could it not be? Wilhelm Reich's middle-class reactionary dominates the radio, the television, and popular culture in general. He is a person who gives the appearance of independence, of rebelliousness, while being capital's most faithful servant. He is a person who has been yelled at, disciplined, and brutalized during the socialization process, only to grow up with no greater desire than to do the same to others. Often he is the hero of high school, the well-trained athlete, the well-trained imbecile. What Max Stirner said of college students in general clearly applies. Trained in the most excellent manner, they go on training. Drilled, they continue drilling. The modern student thrives in a milieu of privileged consumption. All social life is subordinated to the imperative to accumulate commodities that affirm the student's chosen identity within the social group. So much so that it is possible for the student to ignore much of the substance of schooling. Entertainment is organized around subcultural identity, a dead world of media swill with an appearance vaguely reminiscent of actual life, which has been vanquished by modern capitalism. Sexual activity, long repressed, is now tolerated within the context of relationships which could only be described as masturbatory. If it had any meaning, if it opened up new realms of communication, sex would be a force antagonistic to schooling. Instead, it is a safety valve. In Civilization and its Discontents, Freud said that civilization uses sexual energy for its own purposes, displacing it through work, for example. We are now so alienated from each other that it is difficult to conceive of a world in which our energies and desires are not systematically controlled and manipulated, a world in which meaningful communication is commonplace. Our capacity for self-regulation and autonomy has been schooled out of us. We are left with a character armor, the colonization of capital, which protects us from expressing ourselves freely. Politics, morality, and culture are all in ruins and have now reached the point of being marketed as such, as their own parody, the spectacle of decadence being the last, hopefully desperate attempt to stabilize the decadence of the spectacle. Religion is a perfect example of this. It is now often marketed as spirituality, an admission of some vague need to retreat from reality and be enriched by assorted mystical beliefs. Any justification for the present madness will do. Depression is endemic. Drugs and alcohol help out as much as possible, setting the stage for all social interaction. But is it enough? Consumer goods help fill the void, but are they sufficient? So far, it seems to be. The life that gets away from us can always be sold back to us by the mass media in the form of images. All that once was directly lived has become mere representation. For in the mass society, individuals have a tendency to withdraw from each other more and more. Their relationship is only artificial. It is only the product of the mass media, wrote Jacques Ellul. The student often finds more meaningful forms of escapism, ideological escapism. Students are for justice, Che Guevara t-shirts, and affirmative action. And the socialist organizations are waiting to recruit. The student's rent-a-crowd militance for the latest good cause is an aspect of his real impotence. The student serves the cause, and the cause serves to justify the student's subservience. The student activist consciously aligns their thinking with what they perceive to be that of an oppressed group, which they may or may not be a member of. Now they can speak for that group and articulate the desires of that group, usually phrased as demands made of the authorities. Every person, every group must be represented. Representation is at the heart of the logic of modern politics, and its so-called enemies uphold this logic better than anyone. Such thinking is institutionalized among the academic left, who are proud of their broad curriculum, which includes all sorts of women's studies, queer studies, African American studies, etc. As long as students learn to demand justice for everyone, the possibility of revolutionary change can be ignored. Through appeals for justice or equal rights within the system, the academic left perpetuates the system and its moralistic logic. And since academia is virtually defined by the dissociation of thought and action, no revolutionary theory could possibly thrive in this context. Conversely, it is here that revolutionary ideology is at home, an object of passive consideration. The university gives the appearance of fostering learning on one's own initiative. Indeed, many of the controlling aspects of high school are absent, but only because they are no longer necessary. The university student is self-oppressed, a beautiful example of modern schooling's hegemony. Her only hope is to stop identifying with the university and its myths. The student must commit the sin of pride. Non serviam, I will not serve, just as Stephen Daedalus did. I will not serve that in which I no longer believe, whether it call itself my home, my fatherland, or my church. Perhaps the student read this in high school, but thought nothing of it. Perhaps, too, they read the Combine and Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but did not recognize the similarity to their teachers. As long as knowledge is looked at from afar as one views the world of commodities, whatever truths it may reveal remain concealed. The fact that universities serve the interests of power is all too obvious. As Freddie Perlman observed, students are taught to be innovative when it comes to the sciences and the physical universe, but their approach must be adaptationist in regard to the social world. Every academic field must be focused toward progress where it is needed and apologetics when it comes to the effects of such progress. Every individual must fit themselves into institutions, jobs, and the whole social network without ever thinking twice about what is lost. As Michael B. Katz put it, we live in an institutional state. Our lives spin outward from the hospitals where we are born to the school systems that dominate our youth, through the bureaucracies for which we work, and back again to the hospitals in which we die. The university is a perfect representation of our institutional reality. The university is an impersonal bureaucracy, even when it tries to be something else. Alexis de Tocqueville clearly described the techniques through which such institutions function. Administration covers the surface of society with a network of small, complicated rules, minute and uniform, through which the most original minds and the most energetic characters cannot penetrate, to rise above the crowd. The will of man is not shattered, but softened, bent, guided. Men are seldom forced by it to act, but they are constantly restrained from acting. Such a power does not destroy, but it prevents existence. It does not tyrannize, but it compresses, extinguishes, and stupefies a people, till each nation is reduced to be nothing better than a flock of timid and industrious animals, of which government is the shepherd. The university purveys an advanced form of schooling. It is advanced mainly because the university is the schooling institution most directly in the service of capital. But haven't the students had enough of schooling by the time they get to the university? They are most likely tired of it. It is not easy to have your will systematically softened, bent, and guided by authoritarian social structures. Opposition to work itself must now be the basis of any radical opposition to capital, which recuperates all forms of partial resistance. Opposition to schooling is now a necessity for those who resist the domestication of capitalist society. Schools function as the organization of the passivity of the soul, and this is true even when active and libertarian methods are used. The liberation of the school would be the liberation of oppression, wrote Kamat. It is all too apparent that schooling breaks your spirit, and while it is not easy to resist, it is well worth it. Only through resistance to this society can life become worth living.